right, welcome to Chestnut Hill Cemetery for a unique and different tour than we've done in years past. The current crisis has caused us to relook on how we do this tour that we've been doing for several decades here at Chestnut Hill Cemetery. And wanting to try and do something this year, we've come up with a virtual tour and recording it and videotaping it. So Chestnut Hill Cemetery was founded in 1863. It is an example of what's called a garden-style cemetery. These were cemetery types that were extremely popular in the 19th century, in the 1800s. These cemeteries were designed with the landscape in mind. They often had winding pathways, elaborate plantings, or they were situated with the rolling terrain. And one can see that when you walk through the grounds of Chestnut Hill Cemetery. It's situated at the very top of a hill that has this wonderful panoramic view of the surrounding area. And that was done purposely. It was purposely part of the design. And it was part of a design concept that dates back to the early 1800s. Cemeteries before this time period were often during the colonial period in churchyards or on family burial grounds, on farms throughout the area. But by the early 1800s, many of these old churchyards had become quite crowded. And so society was looking for different ways to handle the dead. And what sprang from that were these garden-style cemeteries that were situated on the outskirts of town, bringing in the landscape as part of the design concept. The oldest grave marker here in the cemetery predates the formation of the burial ground in 1863. It's from the 1830s. It's located at the top of the hill, and there are a number of burials here from the 1840s and 50s era as well. And they were most likely people that were buried elsewhere, buried in some of those earlier church burial grounds that were located in the area. And when Chestnut Hill Cemetery opened, they moved the remains of those loved ones to this location. The way that the plots are situated are also different. They're arranged as family groupings, and that also becomes very apparent as you walk through the burial ground here. You'll see many families, many generations of one family in some of these plots, and some of them going back to the founding of the cemetery in 1863. So on the tour today, you're going to encounter a number of individuals portraying people from East Brunswick's past, giving first-person narrations about their life, and showing artifacts and photographs to help tell their story. And we hope that you enjoy the tour.
I am Sarah Chittick. I was born in 1831. My husband was Christopher Chittick, and his gravestone is right behind me, and mine is right next to his. We also had 2 children. When I was 40 years old, my husband was killed in a railway accident. To support myself and my 2 young adult children, I sold my small home and half-acre of land for $700 in East Brunswick Township. I then became a school teacher. In the 1880s, the average salary of a female teacher was $350 a year. The male teacher's average salary was over $600 a year. So for a single woman, that was very difficult to get paid half of the salary. I taught in a one-room schoolhouse which held children from grade 1 through grade 8. The different ages and learning levels of the children were in a single room, with the youngest at the smallest desks towards the front and gradually the larger desks with the older children. The older children would help the younger children to learn. In the schools, we would teach manners, morals, and we also taught reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. The lessons were prepared from a single textbook called the McGruffy Reader. This textbook was grade 1 would be the easiest lessons, and as you gradually increase the studies for the grades 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and grade 7 would be grade 8, would be the most difficult. The McGruffy Reader was used all over the United States. The children were also given a slate board and a slate pencil, and they would scratch out their lesson to do their work. The children were also given a rag to erase their work. The rain is helping. Paper was very expensive during this time while I was a teacher. The children memorized and recited their lessons. In the classroom, the teacher's desk would be at the front of the room, and a wood-burning stove would be in the room to heat, and also to warm lunches and to boil tea for drinks. The restroom was outside in an outhouse. My grandson, Murray Chittick, was born in 1895 when I was 64 years old. In 1945, when he was 45 years old, he became the supervising principal of the East Brunswick Township Schools. He was a well-educated man, and he was experienced as a soldier, chemist, and teacher. The Chittick School, which is located on the corner of Flagler Street and Old Bridge Turnpike, was named in his honor. Today I have been told that the Chittick School is a large brick building that accommodates 500 students and 50 teachers. I also was surprised to learn that children can stay home and listen to the teacher through a magic box, and they can watch and learn on Zoom. Thank you for visiting me. Enjoy the tour.
Hello, my name is Henry Beebe. I lived for 83 years, the last 25 of which was spent in Old Bridge, for which those years were quite pleasant. I am a veteran of the Civil War. I was the last surviving member of the Grand Army Republic in the vicinity of Old Bridge. I had enlisted in the 3rd New Jersey Cavalry in 1862, and in December of 1863, I had re-enlisted in the New Jersey Infantry, for which I was a part of for 3 years. I moved to Old Bridge from Brooklyn when I was in my late 50s. There I had built a home and a store, for which I was best known for selling my fine ice cream. People knew it as the Burdell. It was a quaint little corner store that everyone knew as the sweetest place in town. I prided myself in our wide variety of delicious ice cream flavors. There were also plenty of sweet candies to choose from. Sunday newspapers and monthly periodicals were always provided. Folks would sit and read the latest gossip and while sampling delicious treats. In the winter, I would expand my business into a grocery store because folks didn't want to eat cold ice cream when it was already freezing. But no matter the season, the Burdell was always bustling with sweet tooth gossipers and pecker shoppers. I was also accompanied by my lovely wife, Mrs. Catherine Beebe. She sweetened my life as I know my candies and ice cream did for so many. Take my advice. Life is like ice cream. You have to enjoy it before it melts.
Nice to meet you. I'm Dr. Stephen Von Krasner. Please don't be offended, but I will not shake your hand. I was a bacteriologist, and I feel like you can never use enough hand sanitizer. It's better to be safe than sorry. As a bacteriologist, I have studied the spread and treatment of infectious diseases. I was born in England and attended medical school in Scotland. I'm buried in the Disborough family plot, which is the cross right behind me. Because I married Dr. Stephen Disborough's daughter, Nellie. Nellie was in England on holiday, and when I met her, I knew she was the one. So I crossed the pond over to America, and we got married in 1909 in a big, elaborate wedding. I had one daughter named Elizabeth. In 1928, my sweet Nellie passed away at the age of 47. I worked at a hospital in Newark and made sure every baby that was born there came with a bib that says, "Please don't kiss me, I might get sick." People must understand that that kind of affection can cause infection. I waged vigorous campaigns against infections that I deemed menacing to the public. Some warnings I have for you. The holiday season is coming up. If you plan to visit a Santa in a mall or a shopping center, please make sure he sanitizes his beard and wears white gloves. And please stay clear of the mistletoe if you're with your sweetheart this year. And ladies, please do not use any kind of lipstick because that's a microbiome trap. A local newspaper wrote an article about me in a poem which read, "Beware of the woman's lovely lips. Thus gravely consoles Dr. Craster. At every kiss, or even faster, a million kinds of deadly pips. To give, he wouldn't put it past her. But all I've got to say is this. The doctor can keep his sanitation. Let microbiome swarm in every kiss. I will stick to my osculation." And I passed away at 81 years old in 1953. Thank you for visiting me.
Hello, my name is Martha Spencer. My family owned a local tavern and hotel on Old Bridge Turnpike just down the road. It was known as the Old Bridge Hotel. It was in the mid-1800s. Back then, Old Bridge Turnpike was a toll road. It would cost 3 cents to travel by horse and 1 cent to travel by foot. There were locations at various points for tolls, and those tolls would help maintain the roads on an ongoing basis. So that's why it was called the Turnpike. In those days, there were many hotels and taverns along the way, and that was because this was the intersection of 2 stagecoach lines. So it was a constant stream of customers coming through our tavern. My mother sadly passed away soon after I was born, and my father raised my 3 brothers and I at the Old Bridge Hotel. The tavern was located on the first floor of our hotel, and on the second floor we had rooms for guests to stay. We had some famous people that would stop by often. One of them was John Rockefeller, who would stop in on his way to his shore house in Lakewood, New Jersey. It was also a gathering place for the community. They would often come and spend time, so it was a fun place to grow up. In 1863, when I was a young lady in this quiet town of Old Bridge, a dashing young officer named Colonel Joseph Dye came by and burst into our sleepy town. He was passing through Old Bridge on his way to the Army of the Potomac in the Civil War. I married him after the span of a week, and he took me to stay with his mother. So I left this town of Old Bridge, and I stayed with his mother for 2 years while he was serving in the Civil War. She lived in Stapleton, Staten Island. When he returned from battle in 1865, he took me to New York City, where we went to a boarding house. Well, Colonel Joseph Dye was not a faithful husband to me. He immediately became infatuated with a married older woman, and so I left him there, and that's the last time I saw him. Well, he married that lady 2 years later, and 44 years later, she filed for divorce, claiming he was guilty of infidelity. And he claimed that they were never legally married because he was still married to me, even though I had passed away years before. So this article talks about how at 70 years old, she's filing for divorce, and the judge ruled in his favor. Even though they spent over 4 decades together, she got nothing in the divorce because he claimed they were never legally married. Well, in 1882, Theodore Frank Appleby, who was a wealthy landowner in Asbury Park, had a week-long intoxicated stay at our hotel. Well, on one of those intoxicated stays, I called the Justice of the Peace and I held him up and we were married. Well, according to this New York Times article right here, they're claiming that I was conspiring to obtain possession of part of his property. Well, they're going to have to speak to my lawyer about that because that's just not the case. We were in love. Well, unfortunately, I was killed in a train accident a year later on October 7th, 1883, before the outcome of the trial. You see, I was riding in the caboose of a freight train on the Camden and Amboy Railroad, and the coupling gave loose on the freight train in Railroad Mills, which is now known as Helmetta, I believe. And the freight train that I was riding in went backwards into the engine of another train, and I was killed instantly. And there were 5 other people that were injured in that. This is my last will and testament, where I left my Bible, my mother's Bible, to my niece, and I also left my 5 spoons to her. Well, thank you for coming to visit me.
Good evening. My name is Blanche Rue, and I was born in England in 1870. My father is a noted painter, James Crawford Tom, and my grandfather is James Tom, sculptor. My father moved and worked in France, where he met my mother, Louise Giles. They moved to the U.S. in 1873, but only a few years later, my mother died in 1881. My father enrolled us in the Concord boarding school, where he moved to Old Bridge. My father later married Sarah Bloodworth and lived on Willow Street near Crossman Street now. Many of my father's paintings depicted children at play, and we were often posed in his paintings. My husband, Richard Rue, bought a brick manufacturer in 1916, where much of the clay in South Amboy was harvested. It supplied bricks for most of the U.S. until the Depression. I had 2 children, Gertrude and Milton, with Richard Rue, and I lived until I was 99. I died in 1969, and I've seen so many advancements, from the horse-drawn carriage to automobiles and to astronauts going to space, walking on the moon. Thank you so much for visiting us tonight.
My name is Henry Silcox, and I'm in the cemetery, but I'm not buried here. I was a gravestone cutter back in the 1820s. This is me during my wedding portrait in 1819, when I married the beautiful Isabella Reed Hull Silcox. She's a gorgeous woman, isn't she? We had 10 children. 1, 2, 8. That's 10. So I was a lot better at home, apparently, than I was in the gravestone carving shop, where I worked in New Brunswick for apparently, I'd say about 27 years or more, carving gravestones. I died before this cemetery was founded in 1863, but my legacy still stands here. Off to my left are 2 stones that were carved by my sons, James and Gabriel Silcox, one of which is actually signed at the bottom, which was a common practice in those days. And the Rogers obelisk behind me, where my sign is located, was also carved and carted up this very steep hill for the Rogers family. And that too was carved by my sons James and Gabriel. These stones are carved in marble, which was very fashionable in the 19th century. But when I started carving stones as an apprentice in the 18 teens in Jamestown and then Somerville and finally in New Brunswick, I was working in a material that's common in most early burial grounds in New Jersey, and it is sandstone. You may have seen it in some of the older grounds, that dark, brooding brown color. And back in those days, things were always done with the basics that had been utilized for millennia: mallets and chisels. In order to get these things, we had to use templates. This would be an early example of a gravestone from this early 1700s using mortality imagery. And you can see right here that it's a very simple pattern, and the lettering usually took the longest part to do. When I started carving, I was using sandstone material, as I mentioned before. It was still fashionable, but it quickly faded into the use for marble, which are the materials that you see behind me. It was more fashionable because it was white and it stood out very well against the green cemetery backgrounds. And in these days, in the days of the early days of gravestone carving, mortality was the funerary fashion. It shifted over to something called salvation imagery by the mid-1700s, and it used winged cherubs or soul effigies. And when I started carving, the last phase of gravestone carving in America, or great gravestone carving in America, was the neoclassical phase. That was represented with obelisks like you see behind me, urns, funerary urns, weeping willow trees, figures in togas mourning over sarcophagi. And when I started carving, like I said, those were the funerary fashions of the time. My shop was located around Nielsen Street, right by the Raritan River, which is a good place for bringing in stone in those places. Stone is very heavy, so you want to be by a waterway to bring it into your shop. And as I said, I carved for about 20-something years, leaving the business behind to my sons James and Gabriel, and they continued the business until 1876 when they sold it off to the Kilbourne Company. And this is an advertisement that the Kilbournes actually put in the paper of the old shop. Eventually, fashions changed again, and things became a lot more sentimental. So you found a lot of the mortality imagery was a spiritual thing. The salvation imagery continued with the spiritual aspects of the deceased. And finally, you had the more sentimental things carved by, in the neoclassical, simple funerary urns in memory of, replaced "Here Lies the Body," and things of that nature. By the time I passed away in 1846, the industry had begun to change. Even granite was becoming more popular for use as a stone cutting material, and it remains the choice for gravestone carving today. I'm buried at Willow Grove Cemetery. This is a picture of the family plot. And despite all the ostentatious and ornamental carving that we had to do over the life of the firm, we have very simple, plain gravestones that were buried underneath.
Hi, I'm Frank Hoffman. When I lived in this town, I was a telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad. In 1899, my wife and I, Ada, we moved to South Amboy, where I took a job with the Raritan River Railroad. I became the superintendent of that railroad, and I was able to make that railroad the most profitable railroad per mile in the country. It was a job that I loved. I had that most of my life, working on the Raritan River Railroad. During the silent film era, many silent films were filmed using the Raritan River Railroad, the cars. I had a chance to be a stuntman in a way, piloting the trains that were used in the smash-ups and derailments to create the dramatic scenes in the movies. One of the films that I participated in was in 1914, In the Perils of Pauline, and there was another film in 1916 called The Juggernaut, and I was at the controls of the trains as they crashed. In South Amboy, I ran a tobacco shop, which became a popular gathering place for local politicians. I was very interested in politics. I was a member of the Republican Party, and my son Harold found an interest in politics as well, and meeting all of the people who would gather at my tobacco shop. Harold would go into politics. He'd grow up to become a congressman and also the governor of New Jersey. And in 1923, I served as the Postmaster General in South Amboy. My son Harold G. Hoffman would go on to serve in Congress, and he became the governor of New Jersey. He won the governorship in 1934 in that election and served from 1935 to 1938. He was the youngest governor in the country at the time, the youngest governor ever to serve. He was also governor during the Lindbergh trial, and Harold believed that Bruno Hauptmann did not act alone in the Lindbergh case, and that his execution was going to be too swift, and that co-conspirators in the case would never be discovered if Hauptmann was executed too swiftly. Hauptmann would not describe who his co-conspirators were. He wouldn't reveal that information, and Harold opened his own investigation into the Lindbergh case in order to try and uncover who else was involved in that kidnapping. It was a very controversial decision that he made, and it cost him the opinion of the Republican Party in the state. He was seen as being a political opportunist when in fact he was trying to solve what was the crime of the century. Being a member of the Republican Party, Harold collected elephants. During his lifetime, he collected over 1,000 elephants that were presented to him because it was the symbol of the Republican Party. Elephant figurines I'm talking about, not actual elephants. And the figurines collection was donated to the East Brunswick Museum. So the museum, which is not far from this cemetery, houses a big portion of the Hoffman elephant collection, and you can go and see it today. My wife Ada and I had 4 sons, Frank, Fletcher, Harold, and Donald. Ada's father, my father-in-law, was the famous painter James Crawford Tom, who was buried not far from where my resting place is. Ada and her siblings were often used by her father in his paintings as models. And there are many paintings where I can see my wife's, her face as a child as the model for the people who are portrayed in the paintings. It's a very interesting thing for us to have in our household, the paintings that her father did that are very well known throughout the world, and I know that it's my wife who served as the model when he painted them. James Crawford Tom's father, James Tom, was the Scottish sculptor who worked on Trinity Church in New York City, and his sculpture is also housed in the Royal Collection in Scotland. So we have a lot of artistic depth in the history of our family. It's something that I'm very proud of. I passed away in 1948 at the age of 82. I'm just so happy that you took this time to come and visit with me today, and I could tell you a little bit about my life, my family, and our story here. Thank you.